Dr. Mishra ji, distinguished philosophers who are gathered here today, and friends. We had yesterday a very instructive dialogue. And many important questions have come up. Perhaps this dialogue can continue today also and tomorrow. My own point of view in regard to the concept of complete person, which is the subject of our basic inquiry these 3 days, is that the concept of complete person cannot be understood properly except in the context of evolution. The paper which I have presented here, I think, can be assumed to be read so that I may have the time to speak extempore.
That is right, sir.
After a good deal of inquiry in my own life on this question of person, personality, individual, universal, a number of interrelated problems, I have been led to go back to the Veda in my own search. And I find that although Veda is not a book of philosophy, even Upanishads, I don't consider them to be books of philosophy. But they contain knowledge. Knowledge not derived by philosophical method of inquiry, but knowledge derived by the exercise of higher faculties of consciousness. In the Veda, these higher faculties of consciousness have been described as Mahati, Ida, Saraswati, Sarama, and Dakshina. If we study the Vedic literature more and more closely, we shall find that clear distinctions have been made between these faculties. Mahati is the faculty of wideness of consciousness, to which universality is not an abstract notion, but it is a state of being. Ida is the faculty of revelation. Saraswati is the faculty of inspiration. Sarama is the faculty of intuition. And Dakshina is the faculty of automatic discrimination. Usually in the Vedic verses we find Ida and Saraswati often associated with each other, the faculty of revelation and inspiration. Much of the knowledge contained in regard to these faculties and the results which have been obtained in the Veda by the exercise of these faculties has been brought out to the fore in Sri Aurobindo's work called The Secret of the Veda. There are two important consequences that we find in the Vedic method of knowledge, and that is what is very poorly called intuition in normal present day psychological studies, knowledge by identity. In fact, when we come to the question of knowledge by identity, there has to be somewhere a distinction between subject and the object, which in an attempt to be known in relation to each other, the operation called the proper identity takes place. In other words, in the very act of knowledge by identity, differentiation is involved as a premise. Unless there is differentiation between the subject and the object, the question of identification does not arise. There is, therefore, to start with in the Vedic knowledge, an assumption, an underlying idea of the other. Concept of anya is extremely important in the Veda. Just as ekam is extremely important, the concept of anya also is equally important. In one of the most important statements of the Rig Veda, which describes the ultimate reality in one simple verse, the whole emphasis lies upon one and the other. Nanunam asti no shvaha kastadveda yad adbhutam anyasya chittam abhisancharenyam utadhitam vinashyati. This is the starting point, according to me, if you want to translate Veda into metaphysical terms, and if you want to the starting point of metaphysical statement, I would pick up this particular verse of the Rig Veda. It says about the reality, ultimate reality, it is that which is neither today nor tomorrow. It is eternal. Kastad Veda yad adbhutam. Who knows it, that which is wonderful? And the wonder of it is anyasya chittam abhisancharenyam. It is itself, but it is movable by another. Anyasya chittam, and that too by power of consciousness. That reality has a power of consciousness by virtue of which it becomes movable. Utadhitam, this is the one proposition which is when adhitam, if you try to catch it by intellectual logic, vinashyati, it disappears. It is not seizable by the intellect. But this is the starting point of the Vedic proposition. The entire difficulty in metaphysical thought throughout the history is to relate one to the other. And this we are not able to do, and therefore all kinds of logical theories of one kind or the other, the whole history of thought can be summarized in one word: different ways by which one and the other are sought to be related to each other. And to my mind, all these attempts have been found to be defective. And that's why the conflict and controversy in the whole history of thought. If you say one is the only one, therefore there can't be another, therefore the other is illusion, there is objection to it. If you say no, one and the two both are entirely independent of each other, they are externally related, there is a problem. If you say that no, it is antargata bheda, there is a difficulty. We are all aware of the logic of atomists, logic of pluralists, logic of universalists, logic of monists, logic of pantheists, logic of dualists, logic of Vishishtadvaita, logic of Dvaita, Achintya Bheda Bheda. Basic point is the one and the other are to be related. And this, the Veda starts by saying, it is Adbhutam. It is wonderful. This is the answer of the Veda. Reality is like this. Reality is what it is. Don't say what it ought to be. What it ought to be comes later on. You are not here to manufacture the ultimate reality. Reality exists by itself. Nanunam asti no shvaha. It exists by itself. Your first duty is to see what that reality is. Then you try the various ways by which you can try to understand it. If you have a diamond, you first examine what the diamond is. Don't say how diamond ought to be. It's a datum. You start with the datum. What is the basic datum? And the Veda does not argue because it's not a logical structure by which it has come to this conclusion. It doesn't say reality ought to be like this. Why? Because my intellect can understand only in this way. It is by a direct experience which has been seized by these different operations of consciousness, which are not intellectual operations. By these operations, the knowledge of reality has been gained. You have seen the reality, which is that wonderful, because it is itself, it is other than itself, and yet it is itself. Such is the nature of reality. And we can be quite sure, because now we know the whole history of thought for thousands of years, and we know that philosophers have only dabbled into this basic problem, one and the other, and how to relate them together. And there are many ways of doing it, and each way is objectionable. Unless you are yourself advocate of one theory or the other, if you look at it impartially from above, you will find that each theory is objectionable. There is no unanimity in any case. There is a basic fact. Among none of the philosophers, no groups of philosophers, there is unanimity that reality is this. In that context, if somebody says that even Vedic view is objectionable, I personally feel doesn't matter, start with it. It's one of the theories, but it's a theory which says that reality is one, which is movable by power of consciousness, and that is where it is another than itself. This is the complexity. You may say that reality is at once simple and complex. This may be regarded as a paradoxical statement with which we start. And we admit it's a paradox. Bertrand Russell, while commenting upon the theory, the idea of simplicity and complexity, he says, it is worth examining this point of view. He admits that in all of experience, we never experience atom. He tried atomic propositions. He could not establish them. He said, even when I said this, just to point out this, just to point out that one and nothing else, even there I have to distinguish from all the rest to say it is this. On the other hand, he says, every experience therefore presents you complexity. Now comes the argument. But it is obvious that complexity must consist of simples. This is his basic argument in his whole philosophy. It is obvious that complex must consist of simples. Is it an argument? Is it an assumption? Or is it a dogma? Why should we say that complex must consist of simples? He said it is obvious. Obvious to whom? Surely to him, certainly it is obvious. But maybe not to me. How can he say it is universally obvious that a complex must consist of simple? Here is a Vedic seer who says right at the beginning that reality is simple, is one which is other than itself. It is of such a nature, there is adbhutam. He admits it is adbhutam, it is very strange, wonderful. But such is the reality, you can't help it. In fact, the questions that arise, I'm emphasizing this point because all discussion of complexity, completeness of person, all that ultimately becomes incomprehensible or objectionable from one point of view or the other because we are not prepared to accept a paradox. I personally believe that all theories of knowledge are paradoxical. Not only this,